being starved, being handed the leftovers from slaveholders' tables. That was the reality many enslaved people faced while working on plantations. In those places, black people were forced into labor before the sky even turned light, yet their meals were treated like scraps thrown down, just to keep them alive for another day. A little cornmeal, some salted pork, and sometimes the very pieces the big house had already rejected. But inside those poor cabins, black women took the food and ingredients others saw as worthless, worked them with skill, and turned survival into strategy. With small tricks, sharp minds, and hands that refused to give up, they found ways to fool slaveholders and keep their families alive through some of the hardest years in American history. This is Hidden Black Chronicles, and together we bring buried stories back into the light. Today we reveal 10 real ways enslaved black women used food to outsmart slaveholders and help their families survive. Number 1. Hiding seeds in their hair to survive. From the 16th to the 19th century, more than 12 million Africans were forced into the transatlantic slave trade. Among them were women who came from lands familiar with rice, millet, beans, and yams, places where the harvest did more than feed a family. It carried the memory of an entire community when they were torn from their homeland. Many lost almost everything they could see with their own eyes. Their homes, their loved ones, the paths that led to the fields, the voices calling out during harvest. But some things were so small that slave traders could easily overlook them, while to the people being taken away, they were as precious as the last piece of home still left in their hands. A few seeds could be hidden in the hair. This story lives on in the memory of many African diaspora communities, especially in traditions connected to African rice and maroon communities. Historian Judith Carney has studied these accounts of women carrying grains of rice in their hair as they were forced across the Atlantic. Hiding a seed in the hair was not the same as carrying a lucky charm. It was a way of calculating survival when almost every choice had been stripped away. For a woman to do that, she had to understand which seeds could last, which ones were dry enough not to spoil, and which ones were small enough to stay inside tightly braided hair without being noticed. She had to know how to wrap them, how to hide them, how to place them so the hair would not loosen, so the seeds would not fall during the pushing and shoving, so they would not show when someone looked too closely. In that moment, hair became a secret pocket that the oppressor did not fully understand. To them, black women's hair was often something to mock, inspect, or control. To the woman carrying those seeds, it was a place to hide another season, another meal, another piece of memory. On the slave ship, traders could count bodies, lock chains, inspect cargo, and calculate profit. They could look at a woman and see only property being transported. But if there were still a few seeds hidden in her hair, then even in the middle of that ship, something existed that did not belong in any bill of sale. A small grain of rice could not break the chains, but it kept alive the reminder that the person in chains was never born to be property. She came from a civilization that knew how to farm, how to choose seed, how to guide water, how to feed a community through soil and seasons. When they arrived in the Americas, that knowledge did not disappear. In rice-growing regions like Carolina and Georgia, plantation owners would later make enormous profits from rice, but that wealth did not rise from empty land alone. Many Africans forced into those regions came from places with deep experience in wet rice cultivation, and that skill became something slaveholders exploited, even when they rarely wanted to give credit for it. They had land, money, law, and violence on their side. Yet they still depended on the knowledge of the very people they tried to reduce to nameless labor. That is why hiding seeds in the hair is the story of a woman who understood something her oppressors failed to see. They could steal a great deal, but they could still miss the value of the smallest thing. Think about how brutal and how ignorant a system had to be for a woman to hide her future in her own hair. The bitter irony is that the men who called themselves masters of the fields often did not understand those fields as deeply as the people they enslaved. In places like Carolina and Georgia, many plantation owners had land, capital, and legal protection, But the knowledge that made rice profitable came from Africans forced into labor. Their arrogance sat right there in plain sight. They looked down on African people as inferior, while quietly depending on African intelligence to make themselves rich. And if a few seeds were ever hidden in the hair, then that was more than a trick to slip past the oppressor. It was proof that what the slaveholder needed most could be found inside the very people he believed he had the right to despise. Later, when rice fields across the American South made plantation owners wealthy, few people wanted to say that behind those golden harvests were African knowledge, black women's hands, and memories dragged across the ocean in pain. A seed hidden in the hair did more than help someone survive hunger. It preserved the right to remember who they were, where they came from, and the power to make life grow in a place that once tried to turn them into shadows. Number 2. Using ash to turn corn into food. From 1936 to 1938, the Federal Writers Project in America recorded more than 2,300 testimonies from people who had lived through slavery. In those memories, food appears again and again, not as the warm comfort of a family table, but as part of control. Cornmeal, salted pork, simple foods that might sound easy to overlook, once stood on the thin line between having enough strength to rise again and being completely drained after a day in the fields. On many plantations, corn was often handed out to enslaved people because it was cheap, easy to store, and easy to divide into rations. To slaveholders, corn was just a way to keep black people strong enough to return to the fields the next morning. But once that corn was carried back to the cabin, it became a matter of survival. How could a small amount of dry grain feed children, elders, and people whose bodies had already been worn down by labor? Dry corn was hard, difficult to cook, and if it was not prepared with care, it could come out bland, rough, and hard to swallow. In the poor kitchens of enslaved families, black women learned to use what was left after every fire: ash. Wood ash could be filtered with water to create an alkaline liquid, and that liquid was used to soak or process the corn. This helped soften the outer layer of the kernels, making the corn easier to grind, easier to cook, and easier to turn into hominy, grits, or other meals that could fill the stomach longer. This trick came from older corn processing knowledge rooted in indigenous communities across the Americas. When it entered Southern life, enslaved black women learned it, held onto it, and used it inside the harsh conditions they were forced to live under. They had to know which ash was clean enough to use, how strong the ash water should be, how long the corn needed to soak, and how to rinse it so the food would not turn harsh or difficult to eat. One wrong step could ruin the little food the family had. Still, slaveholders often claimed they were feeding the people they enslaved, when in truth, they only handed down cheap ingredients and walked away. The hardest part was left inside the cabin, where a mother had to turn hard corn into a meal that could feed the whole family. The arrogance of slaveholders was in believing the storehouse was the greatest power. They had the keys, the storage rooms, and the authority to give or take away food, then convinced themselves that black life was in their hands. But they did not understand the intelligence working inside that poor kitchen, where black women turned a cheap ration into real food. How many times has history called this poor food and forgotten that behind every pot of corn was a woman fighting hunger with whatever she had left around her? Even in the gray dust of a burned-out fire, they found a way to keep life warm. Number 3, selling food to buy back freedom. In southern cities like Charleston and New Orleans, the market was not just a place for vegetables, fish, eggs, or hot bread. For many enslaved black women, it was one of the few places where they could earn a few small coins, then quietly hide them away like a piece of freedom no one had given them permission to hold. Slaveholders sometimes allowed enslaved people to sell goods, hire out labor, or bring products to the market, not out of kindness, but because they saw profit in it. Enslaved people could find extra food, cover what their families were missing, and sometimes still had to hand part of that money back to the master. But that small opening became a survival trick. If a black woman could sell a basket of vegetables, a few eggs, cornbread, or hot coffee, she could keep a little money, save it bit by bit, and use it for things the slaveholder never wanted to imagine. Buying more food, helping redeem a loved one, or moving one step closer to freedom. It may sound simple, but it was never easy. A woman had to know what people would buy, what time the market was busiest, who could be trusted, who might report her back to the master, and what price would keep her from being cheated. She had to cook well, sell fast, and still return on time, so no one would grow suspicious. After a day that had already drained her body, she had to live another life on top of it. Quieter, riskier, but also one of the few places where she could still make decisions for her family. In Charleston, studies of black women in the marketplace show that they were not standing outside the economy. They sold food, traded goods, and moved through streets where the law was always trying to control them. In New Orleans, black women selling coffee and street food became part of the city's daily life. Rose Nicaud, a black woman who had once been enslaved, was later remembered as a well-known coffee vendor in New Orleans. Her story reminds us that food in the hands of black women could become more than breakfast. It could become work, dignity, and a path out of dependence. The bitter truth is that in a society that spoke so loudly about freedom, some people had to sell small plates of food just to buy back the right to be human. Slaveholders may have looked at a few eggs, a slice of bread, or a cup of coffee and seen only pocket change. But to a mother saving every coin, that money could mean the distance between a child still held in bondage and a family pulled a little closer together. Number 4. Mastering barbecue at slaveholders' feasts. On July 4, 1840, in Pine Bluff, a large barbecue was held to celebrate America's Independence Day. People spoke about freedom, nationhood, and the pride of those who called themselves citizens of a republic. But behind the smoke rising from the barbecue pit, the person keeping that feast from falling apart was Marie John, an enslaved black woman. Her name does not often appear in the grand stories America tells about itself. But at that feast, if the fire burned too hot, the meat could scorch. If the coals were too weak, the meat would turn tough and stay raw inside. If the timing was wrong, the whole table that slaveholders used to show off their wealth could become an embarrassment in front of their guests. Barbecue in those days was not simply placing meat over fire and waiting for it to cook. It took eyes, hands, experience, and endurance. The cook had to know how hot the pit was, which way the smoke was moving, which cuts of meat needed to sit farther from the coals, and which pieces had to be turned before they burned. Some cuts needed hours before they softened. Sometimes the person tending the fire had to stand in smoke that stung the eyes, with sweat soaking through their clothes, while never looking away from the pit, because one careless moment could ruin the entire meal. That was the skill black women carried into slaveholders' feasts. They mastered the very thing slaveholders loved to show off, but did not truly understand. Marie Jean did not need to stand at the center of the table to prove her place in that story. If the barbecue succeeded, her hands were already there, even if history was slow to call her name. She knew how to turn fire into steady heat, smoke into flavor, and difficult cuts of meat into food the guests would remember. And the slaveholder, with all his pride, still had to depend on the very woman his system treated as property. There is a kind of arrogance that is hard to see when history is told from the dining table. It is the sight of men speaking about civilization, status, and ownership, while being unable to create the very flavor that made their feast worth remembering. They could invite the guests, raise the glasses, and accept the praise. But fire does not burn according to ownership papers. Smoke does not take orders from a slaveholder. Meat does not become tender just because it is placed on a rich man's table. Behind that Independence Day feast was a bitter truth. America was celebrating freedom with food, kept alive by a woman who had no freedom of her own. And from barbecue pits like that, black women carried a skill that America would later call the flavor of the South. But before it became heritage, it was sweat, stinging smoke, and hands forced to work for people who did not want to name the labor behind the taste. Number 5. Growing vegetables behind cabins to fight hunger. When the day's work in the fields was over, for many enslaved black women, exhaustion was never truly allowed to end. They returned to low, dark cabins where the rations from the slaveholder were often only enough to quiet hunger for a little while. Then they would look out toward the small patch of land behind the house. Those gardens were sometimes nothing more than a few rows of vegetables pressed behind the cabin. A few bean plants, some potatoes, or whatever, could grow in poor soil the slaveholder did not care to notice. But for a mother trying to figure out what her children would eat that night, every row mattered. A handful of greens could make a pot of corn feel less empty. A few potatoes could stretch a meal a little longer. A small bundle of herbs could make poor food taste less flat, less bitter going down. Their trick was turning land that others dismissed as useless into a private source of survival. They knew which plants grew fast, which ones could survive tired soil, which seeds had to be saved for the next season, what should be eaten right away, and what could be traded for salt, cloth, or a little bit of money. No one called it an economy. No one wrote it down as an achievement. But behind the cabins in those quiet garden rows, black women were making up for the life slaveholders deliberately failed to provide. A slaveholder could walk past that garden without giving it a second look, because in his eyes, a few rows behind a cabin could never compare to the wide cotton fields stretching in front of him. But that disregard exposed his blindness. He cut rations to save money, then still depended on those women to grow extra food and keep their children fed. Slaveholders claimed they were feeding the people they enslaved, but in real life, black mothers were the ones quietly repairing the part of survival that the system had chosen to leave empty. Number 6. Selling fish at markets to trade for food. In Charleston, mornings near the waterfront often began with the smell of salt, voices calling through the market, and baskets of wet fish being brought in from small black fishing boats. Later, those boats around the area would be remembered as the Mosquito Fleet. Men were often the ones who went out on the water to fish. But once the catch reached the shore, the work of survival moved into the hands of black women. They knew which fish had to be sold while still fresh, which ones should be saved for supper, and which ones could be salted to last another day. In the heat of the South, waiting too long could turn a basket of hope into the smell of spoilage. So a woman at the market had to make every decision before the sun climbed too high. For an enslaved family, that basket of fish could decide whether there would be anything extra in the cabin that night beyond the dry rations handed down by the slaveholder. If sold, it could become cornmeal for the next morning. If traded well, it could become salt, greens, cloth, or a few small coins hidden deep in her clothes. All she had was the basket in her hands, the knowledge in her mind, and the worry of someone with a family waiting for her to come back. Slaveholders liked to believe that their storehouses and keys decided what black people would eat. But outside the waterfront, in the low sound of bargaining through a crowded market, black women were pulling life out of the small openings that slavery had not managed to lock shut. The rations came up short, and the mothers behind the cabins had to find a way so their children would not go to sleep with empty stomachs again. A basket of fish may have looked small beside the slaveholders' fields and storehouses, but in the hands of a woman who knew how to cook, sell, trade, and save every little bit for her family, it became a quiet way to claim one more day of survival. Number 7. Raising and frying chicken to earn money. In plantation life, a small chicken could be worth far more than it seemed. It did not need a whole field to raise, did not require a large pen, and could stay close to the cabin, laying eggs for children to eat. When needed, it could be sold, traded, or turned into a meal, filling enough for the whole family. For enslaved black women, small things like that often became a way to keep some room to move in a society that wanted them completely dependent on the slaveholders' rations. A mother could save the eggs for her children, or keep the best chicken for the moment when there was nothing better left in the house. With a cast iron skillet, a little fat, flour, and skill around the fire, fried chicken became food that was easy to carry, easy to sell, and easy to eat on the road. They knew how to turn a small animal behind the cabin into a meal, and then turn that meal into money that could help keep the family alive. After slavery, the trace of this survival trick became clearer in Gordonsville, Virginia, where black women sold fried chicken to railroad passengers and became remembered as waiter carriers. They walked onto the train platform with trays of hot chicken, selling through the train windows, earning money in an America that still had not made an easy road for black women. To some people, it may have looked like ordinary street vending, but behind it was a long tradition of hard work, resilience, and African American women finding a way forward when the world gave them almost nothing to start with. Number 8. Learning cooking inside the master's kitchen. Inside the slaveholder's kitchen, black women were forced to carry some of the heaviest work, starting the fire before dawn, lifting heavy pots, preparing meat, and cooking for the big house while heat and smoke clung to their bodies. Yet that same place where they were forced to serve also became a place where they learned skills the slaveholder depended on every single day. They learned how to keep the fire steady, how to use salt to preserve meat, and how to turn fat bones and leftover vegetables into food with more flavor, more weight, and a longer life. At Monticello, women like Ursula Granger were connected to the kitchen, the wash house, and the smokehouse, places where food was cooked, preserved, divided, and served for the whole plantation system. The slaveholder may have called it household work, but in the hands of black women, every skill became a way to survive. The bitter truth is that the elegant meals of the big house needed their hands, while their own families back in the cabins still had to struggle with poor rations. So every technique learned in the master's kitchen could be carried back home, keeping meat for one more day, making leftovers taste better, stretching whatever little they had. The slaveholder thought the kitchen belonged to him, but the people who understood that kitchen most deeply were the women he forced to stand behind the smoke. Number 9. Fishing after work to add extra food. After the day's work in the fields, many enslaved black people still had to go fishing because the rations handed down by the slaveholder were often not enough for the whole family. A small fish from a pond, a ditch, or a creek near the plantation could be the only extra food that made the evening pot feel a little less empty. The fishing line might be something they had managed to put together themselves, the hook made from a small scrap of metal, the bait taken from the damp ground around the cabin. For black women, the fish they caught was more than just another item in the meal. It could give flavor to a pot of corn, make the broth less thin, or give a young child something soft to eat before sleep. If they caught more, they could clean the fish, cook it right away, dry it, or salt it down to save for the next day. Number 10. Turning leftover meat into family meals. In the big house, the best meat disappeared first, passing across the slaveholder's polished table and leaving behind only fat, bones, scraps, or cuts they considered worthless. But in the cabin, where one pot had to feed many mouths, nothing could be wasted too quickly. A black mother looked at what was left not as scraps, but as one more way to get her family through the night. She could drop bones into the pot for flavor, use fat to soften greens, and cook meat scraps with corn, beans, potatoes, or whatever had been gathered behind the cabin. That meal did not come from plenty. It came from patience over the fire, from saving the broth, seasoning carefully, and stretching a little flavor across the whole pot. The meal in the big house ended in fullness. The meal in the cabin began with what was left behind. Yet in the hands of black women, those remains became supper, became children slowing down because they could taste meat, became a family sitting close together under the weak light of evening. These stories remind us that enslaved black women turned hunger, leftovers, seeds, and fire into survival. What looked small to the slaveholder became food, memory, and dignity in their hands. To the elders watching, your family may carry pieces of this history too. Leave the word "remember" below, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Hidden Black Chronicles as we keep bringing buried stories back into the light.